Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast today is Ben Shepard. He is a consulting fellow for the Africa program at Chatham House. He has significant direct experience in both the academic world and the real world. He served in the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Office as a specialist on Central Africa and African conflicts from 2004 to 2011. Really happy to have him on the show. This is my favorite episode so far of 2024. But really, this was a phenomenal episode about a topic that is critically important in the world that I don't want to say nobody's talking about it, because as we talk about in the podcast, people do talk about the DRC, but in the same way that most English language stories about Mexico are usually only about cartels, most stories about the DRC are only about violence and war. And we sort of break that apart. And I was even sort of guilty of that going into the podcast, and I'm somebody who overthinks these things a bit. And Ben did a tremendous job in laying out the complexities of the DRC, everything that goes into it, and maybe preconceived notions that we have about it, and also why it is so important. I love Anthony Bourdain, and Bourdain did an episode on the DRC many years ago, and I actually talk about how I thought it was one of the only episodes of Bourdain's show that I thought was a little bit problematic. But I also just want to give you his introductory show notes, because I think he did actually capture something. So in Bourdain's words, I think this is from 2013, the DRC is the most relentlessly fucked over nation in the world. It is a country, a subject so large and so complicated as to defy explanation or any summing up in a sentence, a volume, an hour of television, or even 10 hours of television, and certainly in just one of my podcast episodes. Occupying an ungovernable mass of land the size of all Western Europe combined, it should be the richest country in Africa. It possesses the equivalent to trillions of dollars in resources, diamonds, gold, cobalt, minerals, timber, oil, uranium, everything that the first world needs and desires, and this is its curse. And then it goes on from there. But I thought that was a good summary. Want to thank Ben for coming on. Want to thank all of you for listening. Happy to be back in the saddle here, and happy to start off with such a great and important episode. So email me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you want to talk about the investment work that we do. We actually talk a little bit about investments in Congo and how that sort of works in. So no more ado from me. Cheers, and see you out there. Ben, I was joking as we were prepping to get on that it's nice not only to find somebody who wants to talk about the DRC, but actually knows what they're talking about. And it took me most of last year, I guess, because we're in 2024, to find you. But I'm glad to have found you and glad that you agreed to come on. Thanks so much.
Not at all. Thank you for having me.
I want to start, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, is a country that, it's a country I think people really don't know that much about. It's sort of, if you look at the New York Times or the Washington Post, really any Western newspaper, you probably get an article once a year about how terrible it is, how life is terrible for people on the ground there. If people know about the Rwandan genocide or the First and Second Congo Wars, maybe they have some baseline knowledge. We were also talking before we hit the record button, and you talked about how coverage of the DRC is woeful and also how cliche abounds. And I think that's especially true when you think about, Congo is the setting for Heart of Darkness and Joseph Conrad. So a lot of people think Congo and they start thinking about Heart of Darkness, or they start thinking about Marlon Brando. And Apocalypse Now, the movie. Or, I still vividly remember Anthony Bourdain's episode on the DRC, where he worshipped that movie so much that he wanted to go to the DRC. And it was one of the few episodes that Anthony Bourdain did that kind of left me as a head scratcher. It was not actually engaging with the people in the place, but more about Bourdain's sort of vision of the place, and it's important to him mythologically. And I'm sure we'll get into all that. But with all of that sort of prelude out of the way, I really just wanted to start with a very overarching question, and I'll let you take this in whatever direction you want. But the DRC in various forms and with various names has been independent, let's say, since 1960. And it's basically been in a state of war ever since. And the first question I wanted to point to you is, why is that the case? And is there any hope that the DRC is ever going to congeal into something resembling a modern nation state? Or is this just how the DRC is going to be in perpetuity?
Let's start with an easy one, eh?
Yeah,
there's a lot to kind of think about in the question. first thing I throw back at you, I think a little bit, is I don't think it's not been perpetually at war since 1960. It's had episodes of violence throughout its history, going back to the independence struggles in Katanga and the Kazais in the 60s, immediately following independence, and a number of sort of smaller scale revolts and rebellions that rumbled along through the 70s and 80s. But the violence of the two Congo wars that you mentioned that started in 96 in the dying days of the rule of former President Mobutu, and carried on pretty much unbroken through to 2003, was an aberration in the scale of the violence experienced by Congo. Since then, albeit we think of and talk of Congo as a conflict affected country, the violence has been concentrated into a relatively small geographical bit, largely across on the eastern border, which is a very long way indeed from the capital in Kinshasa. And the majority of the country is peaceful and has been. It's not been well run. It's exceptionally corrupt, to the point where using the word corruption doesn't really mean very much. We can talk about it. It'd be good to come back to the way that the Mobutist era implanted a system, which Congolese refer to as le système, of governance that's about reciprocal relationships and what we'd call patronage, but actually it's just the way things are done. So it's exceptionally badly administered. It can't do public goods. It can't do an army that can achieve very much. It can't do good healthcare. It can't do rule of law. It can't do roads. There's almost no paved roads in the Congo, and no way of getting across the country east to west, north to south that isn't flying or exceptionally slowly. But it's not been a war. And that comes again into the way that we think and talk about Congo. That the violence has been terrible and has affected enormous numbers of civilians, but it has been maybe in 2, 3, 4 territoires across the hundreds there are in the country. And for the majority of Congo's people, what they face daily is not the threat of organized armed violence. It's the threat of depredation, of the daily indignities of dealing with a state that's only ever really been predatory, and managing those short-term needs that people living precarious lives need to do. But I'd flip it and say, actually, for me, given the size of the country, the size of the population, and the minute numbers of people that make a huge amount of money, why has it been so peaceful? Why has there not been a popular revolution? Why is there not more resistance from below? And I think that's almost the more interesting question. As to whether, it will ever look like Sweden, as the cliche goes, whether it will cohere into a state that hits the kind of versions of governance that those of us in the global north and people involved in the development enterprise kind of have as their target. That's a harder question. I think progress is there, but it's very, very slow. It's generational. If you go back to when I started working on the Congo in the early 2000s, I first went in 2002. At that point, just as the country was emerging from the Second War, it was effectively partitioned into three, two huge chunks governed by rebel movements. It's since unified. It's had its fourth election of varying quality, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But seen from the longer historical perspective, actually things have improved in Congo and are continuing to do so ever so slowly. What the final model of the Congolese state looks like, I think that is a very difficult and interesting future-looking hypothetical. One of the big challenges it's had throughout its history, do stop me, I tend to ramble when I talk about Congo.
It's exactly what you're here to do, Ben. Don't apologize for that.
Thank you. Well, don't indulge me too much. Is its geography. It's the cliche goes, it's the size of Western Europe. Flying from Kinshasa to the east is like flying from London to Moscow. The center of the country is effectively taken up by a big chunk of the world's second largest rainforest after the Amazon. It's deeply difficult to cross. It's difficult to build in. As I said, the infrastructure is terrible, and roads don't last very long even when they're built. Partly as a result of that, the population tends to be concentrated around the borders. It borders 9 African states, and each of those communities that live close to the borders build necessary economic ties across borders into neighbors, but they also have cultural, ethnic, linguistic ties across those borders. So there's a constant sort of centrifugal pull, if you like, away from this empty center and out across borders, which enmeshes Congo inevitably in the politics of its neighbors. Combined with the fact that it's not at the heart of any one of Africa's regions. It's not comfortably in East Africa or Southern Africa or Central Africa. It's in all of them. And you see that reflected in the membership of the regional economic communities. DRC joined the EAC, the East African Community, very recently. It's a long-term member of the Southern African Development Corporation, SADC. It's also in CEMAC and ECAS, which are the Central African ones. So all of these things are products of its geographical location, its size, and its internal makeup. And what they tend to do is make it, structurally exceptionally difficult to govern. And it's part of the reason that post-independence, the great overriding imperative for the people who took over power at Kinshasa was holding the country together. And the fear that they had then was that it would spin away, and that, the immediate attempts made by Katanga to become an independent country, I think, have gone in very deeply in the way that the Kinshasa elite think about the country. The answer to that they came up with was centralizing all the resources. So all the money, everything got sucked back into Kinshasa, and then some of it got released back out. Never as much as it should have done formerly. Most of it went out to fund patronage networks, which was the other way that Mobutu came up with controlling such a massive and diverse and fractured polity, was to ensure that everyone was beholden to him. So the system that he put in place was one of ferocious centralization of power and resources, and the personalization of governance, so that people depended on individuals and their individual relationship to power to be able to get anything done, or to be able to, make money or feed their family. And that is the system that's trickled down and out. But you could argue till the cows come home about what drove that. For me, I've come around to thinking that the sort of geographical destiny of the DRC is a big part of the answer, albeit obviously not the only part. You could look back at the legacy of Belgian colonialism, and again, it's fairly often repeated that the tiny number of Congolese who'd received a decent education by the time the Belgians left in the early 60s. I think it was something like 7 medical doctors had been qualified, Congolese. There were no officers in the military. They were all non-commissioned officers. All the officers were Belgian. So it was handed, the rulers of the newly independent Congo were handed a poison chalice. And immediately in the context of the Cold War, at the time, it was understood immediately as a sort of, I guess, a terrain on which global tensions were played out, and became both the beneficiary in Mobutu of Western Cold War support, and the victim of what that meant for the country, because that support was pretty uncritical as long as Mobutu stayed in the Western camp. So there's a lot of geopolitics there, there's a lot of history there, but there's also a lot of geography. That is a very long answer to your question.
It's a perfect place to start, because geography is where we try to start here all the time. And I know a little bit about the history here, but maybe you can help me out here. It seems, and you put your finger on one of the problems. I think there are over 200 different ethnic groups in the DRC. when I was doing research as we were prepping to come on, something like 700 local languages and dialects. From a sort of just straight geopolitics perspective, the reason Congo is never going to be like Sweden is because, well, Sweden had a population that generally had a lot of things in common and that spoke similar languages and, had those sorts of ties, whereas that's not true in the DRC. And the question there, I guess, is, the borders were obviously drawn at the behest of the colonial overlords at one point, but is there any geographic reference for a country in history in the shape of the DRC, or are we really just talking about, before the Europeans got there, just, different disparate kingdoms, and eventually things will revert back to that mean at some point? Does that question make sense?
It does make sense, yeah. Are there other reference points? I think there are plenty of colonial experiences in Africa where the country that emerged from the European horse trading bore very little relation or relevance to the pre-existing kind of political economy or culture of the place. But I think the DRC is probably the paradigmatic example of that. That I'm not a historian. My understanding of the process by which the Congo cohered is not great. But basically, my understanding is that it was the bit that no one else wanted. The Belgian King Leopold, was able to go and claim because it was the kind of negative left when the other bigger powers had gone as far as they wished. And I don't know if you've read the kind of crazy stories. There's a great book called King Leopold's Ghost that talks about the process by which Congo-Brazzaville on one side of the Congo River and the DRC were carved out. One by Ferdinand de Brazza, an Italian working for the French, and one by Henry Morton Stanley, a Brit working for the Belgians, which is sort of emblematic of how kind of ridiculous the whole era was. Yes, you're absolutely correct. It's a massive mosaic of ethno-linguistic groups. It's hard to put a precise number on because they're not precisely delineated often. And yes, there were long-standing and powerful kingdoms that were both absorbed by and cut in half by that. So the old kingdom of the Congo with a K that existed on the Atlantic seaboard, which first had contact with the Europeans in the 14th century, I believe, 14th, 15th century with the Portuguese, straddled an area that's now covered by Angola into the Cabinda enclave and the DRC. And there are still remnants of a sort of a nationalistic Congo struggle by the Congo with the K people. They had a group called Bunda dia Congo, alongside nationalists fighting against the Angolan authorities in Cabinda. But for the most part, those old kingdoms are there in terms of regional identification, and to some extent that translates across into political voting patterns and so forth. If you look at the former Kasai provinces in the centre-south, that's certainly the case, and probably for the Nande up in the northeast. But I don't really think that there certainly isn't much talk about the resurrection of these old ethno-nationalistic identities. In fact, one of the very interesting and kind of perverse impacts of the Mobutu era, despite its sort of manifest malgovernance, has been to leave behind a very strong sense of Congoleseness and a national pride that's very widely shared across all regions and groups of the country. That people are very proud to be Congolese and want to see the country flourish. There are many other parts of the continent that have, much more live ethno-nationalist struggles. You could look at Cameroon with the Anglophones there, or Nigeria or other places. That hasn't really happened in Congo. And in part, I think that's because the country's so big. Even the biggest of the constituent ethno-linguistic groups are pretty small. Everyone's a minority in Congo. And that translates partly into politics. It's not like Kenya where you've got these big ethnic voting blocks. It's a mosaic. And anyone who aspires to hold central office has to build something out of a mosaic, which demands deal making. So my sense of that is no, there's not much likelihood of it reverting to these old kind of political building blocks. But it certainly is really important in understanding why the DRC is where it is now.
Yeah, and I mean, the one thing that, if we're just thinking classic geopolitics that the DRC does have going for it is the Congo River really does connect a lot of the country. I mean, it doesn't get you all the way, it doesn't get you an outlet to the sea, but the Congo River does connect a wide swath of the country, all the way from, the capital, Kinshasa. I guess it's navigable almost all the way up to the northeastern tip of the country, and very, very few countries have that kind of ability to link themselves via a river. And if you think about the United States, Argentina, Egypt, the countries that can base themselves on that kind of river network usually do well and can usually cohere better than others. And I'm also struck by, there's a limit to how you can make analogies between different countries in completely different political contexts. But Indonesia is the country that always comes up in my mind as what the DRC could look like if it was able to overcome some of what you're talking about. Because there you also have that similar thing where everybody's a minority, everybody has their own way of thinking about things and culture, doing things, but there has been this sense of Indonesianness that has been crafted. But the question that I want to throw back to you is, you talked about the DRC's early leaders inheriting a poisoned chalice, and you've also talked about, on the one hand, people being proud to be Congolese, but on the other hand, governments that corruption is too weak a word, that provide none of the services that governments are supposed to provide, and which really haven't built the country and used its incredible resources to create any kind of semblance of forget a modern state, just a state that actually works for its people. So where is the pride in Congoleseness coming from? Is it Stockholm syndrome from the patronage networks that were put in, and it's just a bait and switch? I mean, I don't understand. It's hard for me as an outsider to look at the history of the DRC since 1960 and say, wow, I would be proud to be Congolese, proud to be part of this system that these leaders imposed, or the system that these leaders imposed on the country for their own personal benefit.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a fantastic question, and I don't have an answer to it. I mean, I'm to some extent as intrigued as you by that a response to the systematic misgovernance and the level of inequality. The response is, to some extent, strengthens the attachment, the sort of romantic attachment to the idea of what Congo could be. There's a level of fatalism there. There's a fantastic Belgian anthropologist called Philippe de Boeck who's written a lot about Kinshasa and the worldview of people who are forced to live in the kind of arbitrariness of a world in which nothing follows sort of rational lines, and the things that you cling to, the hopes that you cling to in that environment. Again, I don't want to talk in generalities because Congo's too big and too diverse, but there's a great joie de vivre. There's the wonderful music, which is very well known. People are very open to conversation. It's very political. It's very animated. It's not a reserved place. It's a very kind of joyful place in many ways, which is set against the kind of biting difficulties that people have in their daily lives. And it feels politically that it's almost a reflection of that almost the worse that it's run, the prouder people get of what it could be. And I don't have a good answer for you on that one. I think it's a great question, something that there'd be much better placed people to answer properly than me, certainly Congolese folk themselves. I wanted to come back quickly on the river thing. I think the rivers are really interesting because, yes, it does link a lot of the country. It's navigable up to kind of Kisangani for relatively deep draft boats, and then there's another section that is also navigable beyond that, but there's a block where things would have to, major transit has to move onto roads. Kisangani is kind of bang in the middle of the country. And it's also the limit of the Swahili-speaking zone of the country. So DRC has four national languages, Lingala, Swahili, Kikongo, and Chiluba. But the Swahili-speaking zone is the east of the country, which were linked into the kind of Indian Ocean trading and slavery networks going back a long time that brought Swahili as a lingua franca with them. So you have the geography kind of meshing onto the economic history and the cultural history that's come along with that, with a kind of dividing line at Kisangani. And interestingly, during the Second War, the RCD, the rebel control, reached up to Kisangani but got no further. That was the kind of that was the western limit of. So in some sense, there's a natural fracture of the country, which is to some extent connected, exactly as you say, to the access and the economic links and that come along with the river and its accessibility. And you move a little bit further east than that, and it moves into a different economic and cultural zone, which extends out to the border with Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Tanzania down the eastern side. So the geography is exceptionally important. And I think, as you say, the river could and used to be this great linking umbilical that brought huge sections of Zaire as was together. But it needs maintenance, it needs to be dredged. And it may have been in recent years, but the last time I looked at that, the times it would take for a barge to go from Kinshasa to Kisangani, which is a very long way, had gone up from weeks to months because the channels were no longer there. So they had to have people out the front of boats with poles to stop them running aground, which is another symptom of the fact that if the state fails to carry out these basic functions of, in this case, maintaining its most important, by a very great distance, most important economic artery, then it kind of all flares up, which is what's happened.
Yeah, which is a great segue into sort of stepping away from the history and the geography and thinking a little bit more about what's going on in the here and now. And I'm torn between wanting to start with asking you about the recent elections and what it means for the country. And I read one of your pieces, and we'll put a link to it here, about talking, maybe it's a glass half full and the fourth democratic election, maybe we're getting somewhere towards democracy. But then I'm also torn between maybe wanting to start with the violence in the eastern part of the country, because I take your point, by the way, on the country being generally peaceful. Like I'm guilty of exactly the thing that I hate that other people do. I generalized, violence in one part of the country and didn't talk about how the rest of the country has been peaceful. But the concerning thing about what's happening in the eastern part of the country is that, and correct me if I'm wrong here on the history, because I just did a deep dive this week and I've been all over the place. But it seems to me that the first and second Congo wars, in which almost 6 million people, if not more, died, started with violence in the east and started with ethnic on ethnic violence. And what is Rwanda doing, and how does the Rwanda genocide, you get from those sort of local issues to suddenly multiple states in Africa are all intervening in the DRC and fighting each other there. So I'll give you dealer's choice. Do you think we should start by talking about the election and go into the violence in the eastern provinces? Or do you think the violence is the important thing we should start with and then back into what's going on politically at the central level?
Yes, a tricky one. I think let's talk about the violence first, and then perhaps come back to it right at the end.
Okay, well, maybe you can just set the scene for the listeners about what's happening in the East, because they've heard from us on this podcast for 12 months. Hey, by the way, there's all this violence in the Eastern DRC, and we are ultimately, at the end of the day, an investment firm. So that means we're worried about things like cobalt and copper and all the things that are in the eastern part of the DRC. But we very rarely have gone deep and sort of explained the people and the groups and sort of things behind it. So maybe you can just set the scene as we dig into it.
I'll do my best. We could do 2 hours on that alone. So the conflict that's made the headlines recently is between the Congolese state and the M23 rebel group, which reappeared at the beginning of 2022. There'd been a prior round of fighting between the state and the M23 in 2012, 2013. And at the end of that, most observers, me included, thought that the M23 was gone. And they'd been pretty comprehensively defeated at the end. A few hundred hardcore had fled into exile, largely in Rwanda and Uganda, so over the eastern border. Their resurrection took everyone by surprise. There'd been some talks with the Congolese government about terms of return that hadn't really gone anywhere. The M23 have a narrative that they claim they were betrayed by Tshisekedi not following through on a deal, but I don't know if anything's available on the chapter and verse on that. But nonetheless, they came roaring back, resurrected, to re-emerge in their old heartland, which is just north of Goma. I don't know how well your readers can picture the geography there, but you've got Lake Kivu that straddles the border between Rwanda and the DRC, with Goma at its northern end. Goma is now a big city. It was, until the 90s, a pretty small resort town on the lake. It's very beautiful with big volcanoes up behind it. It's now most definitely the commercial and political capital of Eastern DRC, and it runs right up to the Rwandan border. Just north of the chain of volcanoes is the kind of tri-point between Rwanda, Uganda, and the DRC, with a border crossing called Bunagana sitting there. And the M23's kind of heartland of heartlands was just inland, just into DRC across from Bunagana. So it's very close to the point where Rwanda, Uganda, and DRC come together, which is obviously a very sensitive spot given the history, at a point where an awful lot of trade crosses the border. They have proved able, the M23 have proved able to push back any attempt by the Congolese military, known as the FARDC, to defeat them. They've been able to take quite big chunks of territory in both Masisi and Rutshuru, which are the two Tatwa local government regions up there, and have pushed down quite close to Goma. They've got to an important road crossing at a place called Sake, which is, I think it's tens of kilometers from Goma. So they've been on Goma's doorstep. They haven't taken Goma, which is an interesting point. There are still something like 17,000 UN troops in Congo, of whom a big chunk are in Goma. And the UN has said that it would take steps to defend Goma. It would also raise the stakes politically. It would attract a lot of global attention, would probably shine even more of a spotlight on the M23 and those who may be backing them. So the fact that they haven't gone close to Goma suggests a degree of strategic calculation in what they're doing and not doing. And as we stand, M23 sat there in control of this chunk of territory. It's reportedly raising taxes, it's appointing local administrators, it's behaving like an army of occupation that intends to stay. No one knows with any precision exactly what they want. They've come out with a series of kind of demands, which are not very well articulated, often centering around the return of refugees. And there is a big Congolese Tutsi refugee population in Rwanda that fled often, as long as 20 years ago, has been in Rwanda for a very long time. And refugee returns into Eastern Congo is, again, another thing we could talk about for a couple of hours, because it's exceptionally difficult to do because of the state of land law and land registration in Congo, as in no one really knows who owns the land that refugees will be coming back to. So that's the kind of real point of sensitivity that sits underneath a lot of this stuff. So you've got the M23, but you've also got maybe 120, 130 other armed groups in Eastern Congo.
Just a few.
Ranging in size from probably literal one-man bands, people who just make up an armed group in the hope of accessing demobilization or leveraging that into concessions or cash, up to pretty big and well-established rebel groups of all types, that run the gamut from groups that were spun away from the FDLR, the Génocidaires. The FDLR themselves are still there. There's a numerous Mai groups, which is a name going back to the 50s of local resistance groups. They were grouped under the name Mai, which means water in Swahili. There's the ADF, the Alliance Democratic Forces, which is now formally associated with Islamic State Central Africa, operating further north. So you've got this sort of quagmire of armed groups that range between little village defense militias or a bunch of bandits to much more serious threats. The M23 is one exceptionally important aspect of violence in the East, but it's not the only one. It is, however, perhaps the only one that has, as you alluded to, the brings with it the risks of escalation. You know, a lot of the rest of violence in Eastern Congo has settled into a self-sustaining pattern of economically driven violence, where violence has become a norm, a social norm. And Jason Stearns, who's an excellent and very long-term DRC analyst, wrote a great book last year, drilling into the ways that violence has changed, you know, behaviour both politically and by economic actors in the East. I don't really think, it's my personal view, that it makes sense to call a lot of it conflict anymore. It's sort of entrenched patterns of economically motivated violence that will demand something other than the conflict resolution toolbox of, you know, peacekeeping and demobilization and so forth to answer. I don't know what that answer is, but I'm not sure we're asking the right questions. The M23, on the other hand, is this very strange hybrid between a set of local dynamics around exclusion, and that is centered largely on Rwandan-speaking populations, mostly the Congolese Tutsi populations, which are very long-standing, you know, been in what is now DRC territory for hundreds of years, and who have been the victims of discrimination and violence going back to at least the 60s, sharpened under Mobutu when he used the Congolese Tutsi communities as a bit of a whipping boy to blame for the economic woes of the country. So there's a legitimate grievance there, and as I said, there are these refugee populations who feel themselves unsafe in DRC, who have not been able to return. But at the same time, that local sort of saw would not have expanded into the kind of dynamics that unseated governments in the late 90s and led to what people talk about as Congo's World War, or Africa's World War, sorry, without the involvement of state players. And the involvement of Rwanda with the M23 is a very vexed question. The Rwandan government denies it entirely. The UN panel of experts and others have very confidently said that there is significant Rwandan support going to the M23. If you look at the history of the DRC, it's hard to see an example of a Congolese armed group that has been able to threaten overall national stability without external support. And I think that's probably the case this time, that it magnifies, and, you know, what could and should remain a pretty local dispute in one bit of one province, which is North Kivu, and regionalizes it to the point where it threatens to bring in all sorts of other players. And you do have the kind of spectre of renewed regional confrontation happening in Congo again. Because as you all have read, you know, there was an East African force that was sent in to pacify the conflict. I think there was a difference of understanding between other members of the EAC who thought the force was going in there to interpose itself between the M23 and the Congolese government to facilitate talks between them, and the Congolese government who thought they were coming in to defeat the M23 on their behalf, which was asked to leave in December. And there is now the prospect of a Southern African force coming in. South Africans, I believe, have already deployed some forces to Goma, and there is still the remains of the SADC, Southern African force, that defeated the M23 last time in 2013, which is still there. It became part of the UN, called the Force Intervention Brigade, and that's still in the field, albeit under UN command rather than SADC command. So, yes, people are very worried that this could spin up into a regional confrontation and perhaps even into interstate war, way beyond the scale of the legitimate and local disputes and grievances that are there. and that have been kind of tangled into the kind of shifting tectonic plates of African geopolitics, I think, in very crude terms, in my view, about which kind of economic grouping gets the whip hand in access to the DRC's resources. And that plays into a cliche that it's a resource war and everyone only goes to Congo for their resources, which I don't buy. But I think there is geopolitical positioning going on, particularly given, as you say, the cobalt, the rare earth minerals, as well as every other resource that the Congolese have, are going to be so globally important in geostrategic terms. So you can't separate that out either. So that the conflict is this sort of, it runs from the micro-local about who owns which bit of pasture land in the highlands of Masisi, all the way up to kind of putative Kenyan, South African tensions about which economy is going to have the greatest access into the Congo's economic spaces, and everything in between, which makes it exceptionally complicated to address and deal with, which is one of the reasons it's just rumbled on. That there's enough concern and pressure that no one wants to escalate again. And I don't think we're in a situation where we're likely to see a repeat of what happened in the late 90s and the massive regionalization of this. But at the same time, it's no one's near abroad and it's no one's backyard, and no one wants to take a lead in resolving these big questions because they might come with quite high costs. So, everyone plays a kind of waiting game and tries to avoid the worst escalation, but doesn't want to grasp the nettle of how you might actually bring peace in a place that now, in bits of Eastern Congo, have faced kind of unbroken violence going back to 1996. And generations of young people who've only known violence, which brings with it its own challenges. So again, sorry, another very long ramble, but it's utterly fascinating and exceptionally complicated to understand what's actually going on. And any one single narrative of what's going on is probably wrong, in my view.
Yeah,
it is all of them.
I mean, that wasn't a ramble at all. That was the clearest explanation of this dynamic that I've ever heard in my life. So, congratulations to you for that. But I also think you were correct in beginning with the violence in Eastern Congo because, it seems like we have, well, maybe this is going to be too crude a simplification, but if we go back to the big wars of the late 90s, it seems to me we had two major things happening there. We had everything that you just talked about that's happening in Eastern Congo, and which seems sort of like the second coming of those issues, or they never really stopped. But then you also had really the bankruptcy of political power in Kinshasa. I mean, just the system basically fell apart. It was a failed state, and maybe it's still a failed state, but I think this gets into the question of elections and sort of where you think the current DRC government is, because maybe it's not going to do well in the long run, but right now, as corrupt as it may be, the DRC seems to have a functioning government, and one that is asserting itself in lots of different ways throughout the country. So tell me if that's too simplistic, and maybe that's a good way to dive into the elections that happened in December, which were contested. I saw the Carter Center said a fifth of the polling stations they were at, they noticed irregularities, but it also seems like the result is going to be upheld, which I guess would be a good thing as well. So help us connect what's going on in the East to what's happening in the capital.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely correct in that the wars came out of the complete bankruptcy of the Mobutu regime. From the 70s onwards, he'd systematically hollowed out Zaire's economy and was really only being propped up by Cold War support, which went away in the early 90s. And pretty quickly, the whole thing fell apart. And I said right at the beginning that the Congolese system can't do public goods. It never could. There's an anecdote I got told when I was in Kinshasa once talking about security sector reform and that the nature of the Congolese military. And I was told this story that in 93, when there was serious violence going on in the East before the Rwanda genocide, but it was often Hutu versus Tutsi, but also Rwandaphone against others. Mobutu sent a brigade or a battalion, a large formation of the FARDC to the East, one of his elite army units, to go and deal with it. and then they vanished. The guy I was talking to said they tried to contact them a couple of weeks later, and they'd all just gone. Like, it just, everything fell apart in the 90s. It was completely hollowed out. And when the ADFL, which was the rebel group that was the figurehead, but also had real Congolese roots, marched across the country, there was almost no resistance at all. They were able to walk from the east to Kinshasa. And it all just crumbled in front of them. That is absolutely no longer the case. I think you're completely correct that from the transition from 2003 to 2006, there was the post-war transition where, it was the first step in putting the government back on its feet. And there's been an awful lot of effort from an awful lot of very good, Congolese leaders and civil servants and so forth, trying to do good things. Like, I don't think we should dismiss by any stretch of the imagination the kind of ability and desire of lots and lots of folk in Congo to do things differently and better. It's just that the system doesn't let them in many ways, and they all understand that they're caught by the demands of a system in which they owe their position to people who owe their position to people who owe their position to people, and all of that is on funneling resource upwards and trickling it back downwards into your own patronage networks. I mean, it's a neo-patrimonial case study, and we could talk about that probably a bit separately. But within those confines, I think you're right. That there's been a slow and incremental increase in functionality. The arms of the state, the FARDC, the military is doing better than it was. There's been an awful lot of training that's been offered to them. So would the place fall apart again? Well, no, not in the same way as it did at all. And would there be any enthusiasm from many Congolese people to join a rebellion? No, almost none. And it links back into what we were just talking about in terms of the conflict, that the ADFL was spun up probably by the Rwandans and the Ugandans, by the opponents of Mobutu, but it was very much a Congolese entity with Congolese people at the fore. And there's a direct lineage from that to the RCD, which was the Rwandan-linked rebel group in the Second Congo War, to the CNDP, which was led by Laurent Nkunda, which was the major kind of belligerent in violence between 2007 2009, and then to the M23 the first time round in the early 2010s, and now M23 Mark II. There's a direct coherence between those groups. In fact, some of the individuals have served in all of those rebel groups. But why I say it is they've got smaller, like significantly smaller each time round, and the amount of support they've been able to draw from Congolese people has got smaller, including from the Congolese Tutsi communities that were at the heart of the RCD, certainly in the CNDP, are themselves increasingly wary of being instrumentalized in yet another tilt at the windmill of Kinshasa, because each time it doesn't do them very much good. So the bits that are left of the M23 are really pretty small. We're maybe talking a few hundred hardcore fighters left, where CNDP was certainly over 10,000. The RCD was many tens of thousands. And I think that reflects a growing kind of confidence that Kinshasa's back in charge, that things are moving very, very slowly in the right direction. And to bring it back to the elections, yes, it was by all accounts exceptionally chaotic, and an awful lot of irregularities in the voting, in chaos in delivery of materials, massively delayed opening of polling stations, voting that went on for days past the kind of time it should have done. But it from everything that we could gather before the election, Tshisekedi is pretty popular. I think the best polling there was showing about 55%. it's very shaky because polling is a imprecise art everywhere, but particularly so in Congo. Do I think it's probably the case that he's won the clear majority of votes? Yeah, I think I probably do. It'll be impossible to ever know that for sure, probably. But I think Tshisekedi is now in a relatively strong position. I don't know what you know about his background, but he's the son of Etienne Tshisekedi, who was a long-term pro-democracy campaigner and Mobutu's number one opponent, really, back in the day. So Felix comes from a well-known political pedigree in Congo, but he's not of the wartime generation that Joseph Kabila was. He wasn't a war leader or a militia leader. He was relatively low profile until the election victory in 2018, which, again, according to everything that we can see from Congolese observers, from the churches to everyone else, he shouldn't have won. Again, we'll never know that for certain. But nonetheless, he ended up in charge and has, I think, tried and came in with intentions to change the way things were done. Now, for all the reasons we've talked about, that's very, very hard to do. And there've been corruption scandals and things haven't been as easy as they could have been. But I think for instance, his renegotiation of mining contracts has gone down very well. I think people were very cynical about the deals that were signed by the Kabila administration, particularly latterly, as little more than kind of profiteering. So I think people are pleased about that. And the policy of free primary education, I think, has gone down well, albeit obviously it's not fully universal yet. But his major Achilles heel, and the thing I think that's probably been incredibly frustrating for Tshisekedi and his administration, is the amount of energy and time that's been taken up by this conflict in the East that really serves no one's purpose in Congo, and sucks the very scarce policy and media oxygen out of the room. And only underlines again and again the kind of heart of darkness cliches where we started, right? That the only thing that the Western media wants to put about Congo is stories of suffering and violence and humanitarian catastrophe, which are important stories, obviously, and they're true, but they are not the whole story. And I think it's one of the long-term challenges for Tshisekedi and for the Congolese administration is how to change that mood music, right? And I guess a lot of the folk who listen to you are connected to people who might be thinking about investments, and I get that it's a hard ask, right, for people to invest big sums of money into a place like Congo, given what people think they know about it. But I think it's a bit self-reinforcing, right? That the only stories that come out are ones of suffering and violence. And the things that are done, frankly, in policy terms, as a result of that, and as a result of pressure on conflict minerals, for instance, are not necessarily ones that help the Congolese people in the long run. It's not my area of expertise, but the Dodd-Frank Act that came in part as a result of narratives around conflict minerals took livelihoods away from an awful lot of Congolese people. Off the back of a coltan equals violence narrative that has its root in a coltan boom from about 20 years ago now, and completely elides the much more complicated political realities that drive events in someone like Congo to a very simple story of, it's all about minerals, which has underneath it the idea that people in Congo don't fight for anything other than money, which is not true. So I again, I'm rambling again, but I feel like it would be nice to think that maybe there could be a little bit of coverage of Congo in the months to come that doesn't just focus on the bad bits. But I was waiting braced for being called by lots of media people around this election, and I've had 0 media calls because things haven't gone horribly wrong and there hasn't been a lot of violence. So they're not interested. People don't want to interrogate what's happened or why. You just get the kind of pro forma, chaotic, yes, tick, move on.
Well, I'm happy to be the one request to reach out to you, and you're going to come back on more in the future, I hope. I could go on with you for hours here. I guess and as we said before we hit the record button, there's no way we're going to do the topic justice, but I hope this is a good opener for the listeners. But the last thing I would just talk about was you talked about Tshisekedi, and I don't know a ton about him, but again, to make a forced political analogy, I mean, he reminds me ever so slightly of the Xi Jinping story, which is, somebody who came from a political pedigree, whose father and whose family was affected by that opposition to the system, and gets put under house arrest and has to leave, goes and lives in Belgium for a while. I think isn't the mythology that he was delivering pizza or something in Belgium for a while, and then comes back and is now this leader. And my understanding is, let's say, he won this election, it looks like, and he'll be put back in place, but he can only serve another 5 years. And I wonder, once he gets to 2029 or whenever that transition of power is going to happen, if we do get a democratic transition of power, or if he looks at the country and thinks, no, it really needs another 5 years of me and I'm going to have to change things, or if things in the next 5 years sort of deteriorate. I mean, it does feel like an awful lot is on his shoulders. And I don't know, if geopolitical history teaches us anything, it's that even the most well-intentioned leaders, when they go up against, whether it's geography or less system, as you called the patronage network, individuals, it's usually not a great success rate. But I guess a lot does hang on his shoulders.
It does, but less than it used to. I think one of the encouraging, slow, almost tectonic features that we've seen over the last decade has been a reduction, I think, in the authority of the presidency and a slight reduction in the centralization of the country, and a more meaningful decentralization of authority out to the provincial level. There was a process called découpage in 2015 where they changed the provincial arrangement from having 11 provinces to having 26. They became much smaller. And still enormous in anywhere else's terms, but smaller for Congo, which should come with a more autonomy, authority, and budget being handed down at local level or provincial level, which I think is, to me, the natural evolution for Congo, and probably the best solution to Congolese governance, is that you can't run it all from Kinshasa. It's just too big and too diverse. It has to be run at a level where the governed have some meaningful contact with those they're governing. The other way around, sorry. The governed have some contact with those governing them. That you can have a social contract at provincial level that starts to mean something. Whereas before, people get elected and just leave, bugger off to Kinshasa and never be seen again. And there was this sort of incredible cynicism that politics was only about people seeking to feather their own nest. And that's true everywhere, but, acutely so in Congo. So I think the fact that Felix doesn't come from the background of someone who fought at the head of a rebel group to be the one in charge, who doesn't have that kind of backing, who's had to build that out of nothing. And as I say, in terms of building the mosaic that you have to build in Congo, you've got to do deals with people who have local power bases. You've got to give something at provincial level. And I think for me, that's the positive route for Congo, is that you'll have more localisms, you'll enable progress to happen at provincial level, and the overweening, over-centralized nature of Congolese governance will shift a little bit to something that looks a bit flatter. Obviously, that brings its own challenges. You look at somewhere like Nigeria, which is, you talked about Indonesia, which is somewhere I don't know well, but somewhere like Nigeria, where you have a federated system with much more powerful state governors, and states that can be very divergent in terms of their outcomes. So it brings all that challenge of divergence and of replicating the same patterns of corruption at local level rather than just doing it all nationally. But at least you get some feedback between people and those in power if it's happening closer at provincial level. That does mean that the provincial elections, so the way the provinces are governed is that there's a provincial assembly directly elected, which happened in December as well. The provincial assembly members elect both the senators who go to Kinshasa and sit senators there, and the provincial governors, who are the ones that do the running of each of the provincial government. Those elections are really important, and we haven't had results for them yet. And there could well be unrest at local level over those, because those are the ones that matter much more for people's daily lives than who gets to sit in the big chair in Kinshasa. So we're not out of the woods yet electorally, and I think the provincial stuff is where a lot of those local tensions could come bubbling out. There were some boundary changes that happened quite late on before this election cycle happened. So communities were cut up in different ways to how they had been before, which makes big differences as to who makes the decisions that affect communities in real terms. You know, who is it that's deciding on land claims? Who is it that's arbitrating disputes? So I don't think the decentralization agenda in Congo is a panacea by any means. But I do think the fact that there's a virtue in the fact that Tshisekedi is not a Kabila-type strongman. How that plays out over the next 5 years, I think, will be absolutely crucial. I was quite persuaded a while ago that this election at presidential level was probably going to be relatively calm, routine. It seemed pretty clear from a while ago that Tshisekedi held most of the cards. But as you said, he can't stand for a third term. And I don't think the system would tolerate him trying to. And if you look at the process by which Kabila was unseated last time, it happened because he outstayed his welcome. He personally became a lightning rod for public anger, civil society anger, and a target for the churches. And the churches are hugely important in Congo. And they were incredibly brave in taking a stand against Kabila's attempts to delay the elections in perpetuity, the glissage idea in 2016, 17 and 18. So there is a kind of pathway of resistance laid out pretty clearly. And I think Tshisekedi would find it pretty hard to make that stick from a population perspective. The other issue he's facing is the fact that he's got a coalition at the moment with some big hitters in it. You look at people like Jean-Pierre Bemba, who was a rebel leader from the Second Congo War. Again, the son of a Mobutu-era businessman, a very wealthy family, who's currently Minister of Defense. He was Joseph Kabila's main opponent in the 2006 elections, and didn't lose by much. He may well want to run. There's people like Vital Kamerhe, who's a long-standing politician from the East, who's very impressive, and who may also have presidential ambitions. And then people like Moise Katumbi, who was a candidate this time, looks like unsuccessfully, but has a lot of resources behind him, a very wealthy businessman in his own right, who may want to go again. So the manoeuvres will start at presidential level probably in about 2 years. And holding a political coalition together is hard enough in Congo at the best times. But when your key sort of lieutenants may themselves have ambitions to succeed you, there's a political headache there for Tshisekedi in terms of keeping that show on the road and keeping the ability to do anything, really, if Congolese politics fractures into infighting. So he's going to want to make progress quick. He's going to want to get what he wants done in 2 years, I would say. Never say never with the temptation that always exists around power of deciding one way or the other to try and extend his stay. We've seen Lassana Ouattara do that in Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, who was a very Western-centric, technocratic leader who was brought in because he was not brought in, he won elections, but he wasn't the kind of old school African big man that was going to want to stay, and lo and behold, he stayed. So never say never, as I say, but I'd be surprised. But I think probably we've got maybe a couple of years of relative opportunity for the Tshisekedi administration to make some progress. The big question mark over that is whether they can find a resolution in the East. And we just don't know what a post-inauguration Tshisekedi will look to do. I mean, if you take the political pressure away from him, having now been elected, he might have more space to compromise, albeit compromise would be exceptionally unpopular in Congo. Or he might think, right, I can now really go for it and try and turn the heat up again. Or the most likely outcome in my mind is that it stays as this kind of hurting stalemate. That doesn't escalate horribly, but is not resolved either. Because for the moment, I think most of the players are getting kind of more from it carrying on than they would from it being resolved, sadly. So the East will probably stay a great sink of energy and time and resources, and obviously a huge humanitarian burden on Congo's population. But underneath that, I think maybe there's a couple of years where we might look to see some things happening in Kinshasa. So it'll be really interesting to see how that pans out.
You know, I'm reminded of, there's the quote, power corrupts, but Robert Caro tweaked that and said, power doesn't corrupt, power reveals. So I guess we'll find out about Felix here over the next couple of years. Ben, I could talk to you forever, but I got to let you go. And my commitment to you is that I will bring you back on in the near future, not because things are going bad in the DRC, but because we just want to check in and see how that change is happening over the next 2 years. So at least in one place in the world, we'll be talking about the full tapestry and not just the shit happening in the East. So thanks so much for coming on. We really appreciate you.
Good stuff. No problem at all. Very happy to come back. Always happy to ramble incoherently about Congo. So please do.
I'm happy to listen coherently. So there you go. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.